Hello, Sophie here. So I got to apologize. I've been sitting on these brushes for quite a while. I got distracted doing something else for a while. And when I started using them again a few weeks ago, I was pretty impressed and proud of myself. So I made this video when I first started using grease pencil, and let's see how my process has changed 2.5 years later. So, you can download. Wait, this was my first Gumroad product? We've come so far. And since we're speaking about Gumroad, these brushes are available now. So that's over 100 brushes individually made by me using real watercolor textures. You'll also be able to download this blend file of this artwork, as well as the real-time process video footage of me making it. Now, I've seen amazing textured brushes that people have made for grease pencil, and I'll link them in the description box below. But sadly, I learned pretty quickly that my computer can't handle them. That is still true. I have the same laptop still. My blend files really start to struggle the more geometry I have in my scene, and since I make pieces with a lot of strokes, it's important that I make strokes that don't have too many points. When the stroke outline feature came out, this really changed my workflow. It was an easy way to get these beautiful textures in my work without too much geometry. So I made these videos about it. You can check them out if you want a more in-depth look, but I will briefly be re-explaining stuff here. So what makes these new brushes different from some of my previous brushes using this feature is that these new brushes have color. So in my first brush pack, these textures were all just black textures on a transparent background. The blend value of these materials was all the way up at 1, and so they would fully become whatever vertex color was selected when you made a stroke with them. I still definitely use these. They are more versatile since they can be any color of the color palette. On the other hand, for these new brushes, I'll keep the blend value at 0 or close to 0, more on that later. So I use them more for their unique color. These brushes are divided into folders by their dominant color, but what I love is that they can have color variation within a stroke. So rather than being 100% a single color, now I can create strokes that are purple-red, yellow-orange, yellow-green, blue-green, and so forth. It is just a very appealing look to me. Since there are so many brushes, I'll add them one at a time as I use them. I tend to use only 3 to 6 brushes like this for a piece. I'll probably just select 1 to 2 brushes for each color I want to use, and I may not even use every color of the rainbow depending on what color palette I want to go for. I really like this as an idea. It means that each piece will have a different combination of textures and colors, and it makes me feel like each piece is special. So yes, I'll add them one by one. The cover images folder shows how the brush strokes look layered on top of one another, but if you want to see how the textures themselves look, you can check out this folder. So once I've decided which brush I want to append, I'll go into the folder with all these brushes, into the subsequent color folder, and then open this blend file. Go into the brushes folder, and all my brushes always start with SJ, and select the brush that you want. Then 2 things to use this brush correctly. First, you'll want to add the texture associated with it to your materials list. It's the same name as the brush. And each brush has a solid stroke material pinned to it. Because the stroke outline feature works such that you want to create a normal stroke shape, and then that shape will turn into the fill texture, which is how the watercolor image shows up within each stroke like magic. So when a brush is appended, that pinned material is also appended, and in this case I already have a solid stroke material in my file, so a new version was added with my brush. You don't need to change it, you can just make a stroke and that new material will get added to your materials list. But I find that can get a little cluttered, so alternatively, before you make a stroke, you can just select your original solid stroke material from your materials list. And so that is a material that just has a stroke and no other settings changed, and double tap on this pin icon to change it. Also, I've been working more and more with multiple grease pencil objects in a scene, so I recently learned that you can shift select multiple objects, and then from one of them, you can copy materials into those other objects, either one at a time or all of the materials at once. In this video, I'll be taking you along with me as I use them to recreate this botanical illustration Is this even watercolor? I don't think I knew at the time and I'm still not sure. Anyways, this time around, I'll be recreating my own artwork that I originally made from this piece. And this time, I really want to emphasize the watercolor look. So step 0, if you will, is adding a paper texture. I'll also include, and this is the last link, I swear, an article that explains in depth how to add background images to your blend file because I don't want to just I'll be using the same paper texture linked below because I do still always work with a paper texture background. I just love the look of that. And actually, the same article that I originally linked has since shared an updated method for adding a paper texture, and this new method works so much better. So in the World tab, I'll keep the surface as the background, but change the color by pressing this dot to an image texture. And then I can just open and insert my paper texture into here. And one last thing is this vector here, you need to change this to window. So now when I'm looking at my scene through the camera view, I see the paper texture and the camera view can be accessed with numpad 0 or this icon. The paper texture stretches to the size of your canvas. So for a horizontal paper texture like the one I'm using, I'll give myself a horizontal canvas. And I usually don't want to see this tiling effect depending on how the paper texture looks. So in this case, I can change it to extend. Finally, onto the sketch. I'll keep this brief because I don't actually have a brush for this. I just use the pencil brush as is. But yeah. Man, sped up time lapses are like one of my least favorite things to watch back. All the flickering stuff happening. When I'm done, I turn the opacity of my sketch layer to between 0.2 to 0.3, and here's the final sketch. This took me about 45 minutes. I don't feel like sketching this again, I'm just gonna be honest. So I will append that from my previous blend file real quick, and I'll keep only the sketch from that grease pencil object. Sketching is my least favorite part of making art. I do have videos though where I talk through how I sketch, how I capture proportions, my thought process. If you're interested in that, I'll have that linked, just not today. Not today. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Line art. For this piece, I did the line art on 2 separate layers. One for the flowers themselves and another for everything else. I haven't done line art like this in so long. I forgot I ever did this. Because the flowers had mainly a pink color, and here's the final line art layer. This took me about 1 hour and 30 minutes. Random tip. 1 hour and 30 minutes of something I don't enjoy. Not today. Not ever again. Okay, so my new method involves just going right in with colors, so let's do that. I've created a new layer on top of my sketch layer, and with one of my red watercolor brushes, I will just start making strokes. Something else unique about these brushes is that they aren't a repeating texture. Of course, repeating textures are useful for filling in large strokes, large areas, but sometimes trying to get a texture to repeat can result in some weird or wonky tiling. So this allows me to get the original textures as they are in all of their beauty without having to modify them. So the location, rotation, and scale values of the different materials were all very specifically set up. My goal was so that I could make a stroke and it would look nice. I'm pretty sure all of my brushes start from transparency and transition into color because I think that looks great. And again, the cover images show you how each brush looks when you make a stroke with it. So the brushes are set up to look nice, in my opinion, when making a stroke. And since the values of the materials don't change, each stroke should start with the same portion of the texture. So at first, each stroke of the same brush will look the same, and this also means that parts of the texture may not show up in a typical stroke. So with that in mind, sometimes I like to use the Transform Fill tool in edit mode to modify how the texture shows up within a specific stroke. So I can modify its location, rotation, and scale as I want. And what I find really cool with the stroke outline feature, so each new stroke I draw gets automatically selected in edit mode. So what I usually do is I'll make a stroke, and then when I go into edit mode, it's already selected and I can modify it if I want to. And then with Alt-A, I can deselect all strokes. Now when I go back into draw mode and make a stroke, I know that that stroke will be the only stroke selected in edit mode, and if I want to, I can modify it right away. This is also helpful because, admittedly, sometimes drawing in the strokes, the textures show up weirdly because of how the strokes were drawn. So in this case, I may undo and redo a stroke or just transform it in edit mode. So now, let's talk about blend value a bit more. So most of these brushes do have a blend value of 0, meaning that vertex colors have no effect on them. There are a couple of textures that just looked a bit off without any blend value. So in that case, their blend value is indicated in their names. But what I like to do is to add in some vertex color when I think it will be helpful. So I made these strokes with no blend value. Then I decided I wanted to add some in, and I set to recoloring them in vertex paint mode. I really like that this allows me to get slightly different tints of the same color and still have a lot of that color variation that I talked about show through. On the other hand, I decided to give this brush a rather high blend value, and so I used it to add in colors beyond the original color of that brush. But what I like is that since the blend value was still not all the way up at 1, these strokes are still partially that original color. And so I'm able to get different colors while still having them be unified. They all have this yellow in common despite being from different ends of the color spectrum, and that helps me to make pieces that feel cohesive. Random tip number 2, keep your palette limited. Every time I use a color, I press this button to save it. As you can see, it now appears at the bottom of the palette. For this entire piece, I only ended up using 8 different colors, and here they are. Okay, so I still do something like this. But what I do now is I'll usually start a piece with no restraints, using whatever textures I want and picking colors from my color palette freely. Like I mentioned about blend values, these strokes will be tinted with the original color of that brush, which helps me to create a unified color palette without thinking too hard about it if I just limit the amount of textures that I use. And then I'll use the color palette and go all over my piece, picking as many unique colors as I can. So this selection of colors is what I will use going forward. Next is what I call pencil crayon. With this brush, I scribble. I add in sketchy lines because that's a look I personally really love. I'm gonna circle back to an earlier part in the video because I've kind of combined these two sections. But basically the biggest change I've made to my line art brush is that I set the hue randomization to 1 and it affects the stroke as a whole. I am still madly in love with hue randomization. I've just toned it down a ton. So here are the randomization values of my current default pencil brush. This is the brush I always use. It is free to download. It's from this brush pack, this brush specifically. 2 years later, I still use this brush for every piece I make. So with this brush and this hue randomization setup, I'm doing a sort of blend of line art and cleanup. So I am adding outlines where I feel they'll benefit the piece, but this time I'm not outlining everything. Oh, interesting. So here I tried to add some of these petal indications like I had in my first piece, but I did not like them. So now you see I'm deleting them and keeping it a lot simpler. It's also hugely helpful for me to think of my painting process as a cleanup process. So how I deal with the pressure of the blank canvas is to just throw color and texture onto the piece. This phase is so playful for me. It's so much fun. And at the end of that phase, the result, it's imperfect because textures and colors, they have their limitations. So then I get to fix this imperfect base, and my brain loves fixing. It's so motivating for me to look at a piece and be like, this is wrong. This is wrong because of this. Let me fix it. Please let me fix it. That is like the easiest way for me to get like instant painting flow state. But imperfect doesn't necessarily mean bad. And I like to keep some of these original textures, especially around the outskirts of a piece. So I'll tend to render the focal area, in this case the flowers. But notice how the stem and leaves are very unrefined and they fade into the background like watercolor. So if we want to talk time, the first 30 minutes was spent adding these watercolor textures, followed by an hour and 15 minutes of this crayon phase. But I do want to also mention that even at this stage, I'm going back to my watercolor brushes, and I'm still occasionally adding those textures when I notice a part of the piece that I think could benefit from it. So as I was working on the script for this video, it was at this point in my process, I was unsure if I even liked my new version more than the original piece, kind of stressing that this whole video would be a flop. So I really liked the crisp outlines of the first piece that I made, as well as the higher contrast that it has. It has lighter lights and darker darks than my remake. And you know what? Even now, at the end, I can still respect the original for those reasons. But I do feel like this new piece fits the prompt better. I do think it's less refined, but that is what I think of when I think of watercolor. I feel like I was better able to hone in on what details I thought were important and to keep a lot of it simpler. It's also interesting to me that this first piece took about 4 hours to paint versus less than 2 hours for this new piece, which that also kind of fits my understanding of watercolor. You know, it might be unrefined in places, but that's part of its charm. So maybe I'll refrain from pitting them against one another. I think that they accomplish different things, and I am a proud mom to both of them. So thank you for being here. Liking and subscribing would help me out a ton. As usual, you can find me everywhere at Sophie Jantak, and I will see you very soon. Why did I not think about adding that until now? I absolutely want to see if you make something inspired by this video. Please share with me. Okay, talk soon. Bye.